What I'm going to do, I don't have a presentation. I'm going to, I actually prepared a speech. But to prove that I'm in the 21st century, I'm going to read it from an iPad. So that's, I hope you understand that shows that I'm fashion forward. For those, I guess I should say, the reason I have a perspective on this, for 35 years I was a banker, for 25 years at Citibank in 11 countries. For 18 years I've been CEO of 5 banks in Russia, including Citibank and HSBC and a couple of Russian banks, for a couple of oligarchs, one who's still in jail and one who's definitely not in jail. I'm now with Ernst & Young, and I'm the Finance and Investment Chairman for the AEB, Association of European Businesses, and I'm also on the Citi UK. So there you go, it's a long and distinguished career that's coming to an end. It is a decisive topic. Who was responsible for the continuing crisis? Many argue that it was us bankers who were the root cause, driven by greed and an irresponsible attitude to lending. Some that the political class is responsible, and it has shirked its responsibilities and demonstrated a complete inability to take decisions and implement actions to head off the continuing series of negative developments. Actually, after this morning, I really feel like, will it ever end? And some who say that it was the unbridled consumerism that fed the need for ever-increasing leverage, and that the public, and for which read electorate, has shown itself unwilling to shoulder the need for austerity to redress the balance. It is tempting to say that playing the blame game is retrospective and it doesn't solve anything and should therefore be avoided. This, unfortunately, is not an option. The world continues to face a giddying set of obstacles, and clear, impartial analysis is needed to facilitate senior decision makers, whether in business or government, to devise an action plan. Policymakers and regulators are facing dynamically opposed challenges. On the one hand, there is a need to rein in budget deficits fueled by excessive public spending and to impose tighter regulations on the banking sector to control individual and systemic risks. On the other, there is a need to stimulate economies anemic from the financial crisis. The revised set of Basel regulations for the banking market sought to address some of the fundamental weaknesses seen to be exposed by the events of the 2008 financial meltdown. Capital requirements to cushion downside risks were to be raised, liquidity and leverage measurements imposed to prevent excesses, and to act to ensure banking practice remained essentially conservative and banking remuneration controlled to ensure an alignment of risk, responsibility and reward. Clearly there was a view that a lot of risk was taken, a lot of reward was given, and no responsibility was assigned. Efforts were also made to prevent systemic risks from developing and to deal with the issue of regulatory arbitrage. Time has passed, and it is now appropriate to take a look at how these initiatives have fared and whether, on balance, the enhanced regulatory environment is achieving its stated purpose of heading off the impacts of the last financial crisis whilst creating a system that is less vulnerable. Well, unfortunately, water will find a way. How realistic is it to mandate remuneration practices for private sector banks paying what they believe to be fair compensation? Likewise, how can public sector banks attract the best talent if they're unable to compete in the global, transparent, and internet-enabled international jobs market? Senior bank management realized that if it unilaterally reduced compensation, there was a very real risk that its star profit generators would simply walk across the road. By the way, having been in the position of running a bank, there are people in the bank who, when they have a good year, demand great compensation, and when they have a bad year, demand great compensation, or they threaten to move across the road and not deliver profits the following year. While the politicians sought to impose a systemic solution by defining maximum industry practices, bankers and their lawyers immediately set out to work legally to ensure that their core revenue streams were protected and that they found a way of compensating their folk. Many resorted to the tactic of increasing base compensation for key employees to ensure that the restrictions on the bonuses would not bite. On the one hand, this is simply the free market dealing with a perceived threat. On the other hand, however, and I think this is important, it creates a dangerous imbalance again where risk and reward are not aligned. If you're on a fixed compensation that's been jacked up to keep you in the bank, what is your likelihood of taking excessive risk? If there are no clawback provisions in the compensation structure that would be brought to bear in the event of poor performance in the future, over-aggressive risk policies will again reappear. This raises the fundamental challenge of creating an appropriate risk culture whilst enabling the business drivers to maximize returns on risk taken. First, it is necessary to establish a risk vocabulary encompassing all elements of potential risk and mapping these against the 4 risk quadrants. I know you want me to go through the 4 risk quadrants, but this is not one of my university lectures, so sorry. Once completed, the dialogue between management and shareholder, normally through the supervisory board, can establish the risk appetite and parameters. With a risk framework in place, it is then possible to create the organization chart to deliver a business plan that tracks the risk-reward parameters and horizons established by the prior dialogue. Populating this chart with individuals who are capable and motivated to deliver against the KPIs is the key success factor in my mind. The 2 ends of the spectrum of risk managers must be avoided. Gone local, where fully embedded with the business and too close to their profit dynamics, or Mr. No, remote from the business and unmotivated by anything other than preventing the downside. Naturally, the differing roles of business driver and risk manager require differing characteristics. However, at least in part, the risk manager should be motivated by a long-term career with little volatility and essentially high perceived status. There are, of course, unintended consequences of the heightened regulatory environment. I'm involved with the B20, as I mentioned this morning, and one of the major issues that's come up is this issue of what is happening to banking, to the SME sector in particular, in this new environment. No one can argue with the core objective of making the banking industry more resilient. However, as with everything else in the business environment, this is not being done in a vacuum, and the ecological balance of the financial system is being threatened. Specifically, banks are coming under capital pressure that can only be addressed by either raising capital in difficult markets or reducing balance sheets. And motivated by a desire not to weaken the position of existing shareholders through dilution at low prices, managements and board members are seeking to control and reduce their lending activities. Availability of funding for SMEs and a reduction in trade finance facilities, which no doubt Thierry will talk about, caused by a lack of carve-out for self-liquidating loans, looks as though it may be acting as a dead weight as governments seek to re-energize their economies. The risk process is the skeleton of a bank around which businesses can be built. It is extremely important that management and shareholders understand that risk cannot be addressed solely by a set of policies and procedures, and that these are only helpful, especially when the new ones are layered over an existing structure, if they are accompanied by a training program to introduce these to staff and to reinforce, and are reinforced by a review mechanism to ensure that the new approaches are correctly implemented and are utilized on an ongoing basis. The nightmare is that you have a bunch of new processes and a bunch of new regulations that come in that cause massive inefficiencies that lessen your ability to deliver and that don't produce the results because they don't actually change the corporate culture. The real guardian of the correct balance between risk and reward is not to be found in the manuals, but in the risk culture of a bank that bridges the gap in circumstances not envisaged in the policies. An important element of the new regulatory environment is to attempt to ensure that both individually and collectively, banks do not repeat mistakes that led to the 08 crisis, and that systems are strengthened to enable economies to become more resilient. It is important not to overlook the role of leadership and training in preparing management to become more proactive in true risk management. The concept, as I touched on this morning, of black swan risks, unpredictable and with extreme impact on the business model, has meant that in addition to traditional risk management processes, it is now important for management teams to practice crisis recovery techniques as well as scenario planning. As each country has sought to address the excessive risk that has accumulated either on the private sector balance sheets or within the public sector, they have started a full review of the regulatory environment. Whilst on the one hand, the whole purpose of the Basel III Accords was to ensure a common approach, there have nevertheless been different speeds and in several cases, different approaches taken to enhancing this environment. This is perhaps the most evident in varying approaches being taken to compliance. The complications of onboarding clients are significant now, and in many cases, the highly administrative set of procedures do not substantially add to a real understanding of the core risks associated with the client. Additionally, the unilateral imposition of regulatory requirements, as evidenced by the American rollout of the FATCA requirements, show the need for more careful coordination between regulatory bodies. It's not clear in Russia how we're going to deal with FATCA and whether or not there's going to be any agreement between government and government. The danger of overloading smaller banks with excessive, complex, and costly risk control systems may have the opposite effect to the one intended. There needs to be a thoughtful review of whether it is appropriate to force all banks to the same standards within the same timeframes. While some flexibility has been built into the deadlines, this may not be enough, and it may cause an excessive cost structure combined with overly conservative and unresponsive credit processes. In conclusion, the world enjoyed tomorrow today on debt, and it is now being forced into the painful process of repaying its future debts. It may be attractive for some to paint the bankers as the responsible parties. However, the real picture is more nuanced. There was a broad array of constituents who came together to create the environment in which the world now finds itself. Bankers, certainly, but also their customers, who are happy to take the easy money being offered by the banks. The regulators, and the rating agencies, who somehow missed the impending storm, and of course the politicians, who enabled excessive spending and built budget deficits. In response to the crisis, it was appropriate that the regulators reviewed banking practices to reassert an appropriate balance between risk and reward, and to attempt to prevent the reoccurrence of the systemic issues. However, modern interdependencies mean that this is a complex undertaking, and there is a need now to take a pause and reassess which efforts have worked and which require recalibration before it's too late. That finishes my prepared remarks.